Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you to another edition of our Let Us Reason show. Today, we're going to have a really exciting topic, and it's one of those topics that excite me because it digs deeper into the scripture, the Word of God, and especially if it is from the Old Testament, which is oftentimes neglected, yet it is so rich with so many things that point to Christ, so many things that will at least allow us to understand what did Jesus mean, or what did the New Testament writers mean by certain things, and so on and so forth, because oftentimes we do not really pay attention to foreshadows or types of Christ or even any stories that are leading to understanding the gospel, understanding the work of Christ, and so on and so forth. Today's topic is no exception. We are going to be focusing, when I say we, myself and our guest, our brother here, Anthony Rogers, whom I enjoy working with when it comes especially to deeper issues like this. He's going to put the spotlight on Isaiah 53 and show us the intertextual connections between Isaiah 53 and Genesis 22, where the Jewish thoughts and the traditions lately, at least if you read about that, they call it Akedah, which is the binding of Isaac. And that's something that they celebrate on an annual basis. However, maybe the title did not capture the essence of what Anthony's going to talk about. So possibly I'll modify the title a little bit after the show, because I want him, first of all, to cover everything that he feels is necessary, and will ensure that the title, if did not capture it, will capture it as well. With that in mind, I want to welcome, of course, our dear brother Anthony. Anthony, thank you so much for taking time to be with us here. And of course, you got me excited when you talked about Isaiah 53 a couple of times when we met and talked about this. So now, finally, we're going to dig into it. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, great. It's good to be with you. It's good to have an opportunity to address your audience and certainly this topic. So I have a debate coming up with Muslim apologist Shadid Lewis, actually two debates, one on Isaiah 53 and one on John 1. In the latter, he's going to be arguing that Muhammad is the prophet mentioned in John 1:19 through 28. So people can look out for those. But that's what kind of triggered my thoughts along these lines, that this would be a good topic for us to discuss. So we're going to do several shows on Isaiah 53. And I think people will be surprised at just how much there is to say and how much depth there is with respect to this in Scripture. So what I want to do today, well, first I want to define a couple of terms that I'm going to be using so that I don't have to pause and explain them along the way. But I do this a lot on my channel, where I talk about what's called intertextuality and intertextuality. Now, some scholars use different terms for this, but the basic idea of intertextuality is, and notice it's intertextuality, I-N-N-E-R. So intertextuality refers to something within a document, say the book of Genesis, where one passage says something and then another passage somewhere else in Genesis says something. And there's not only a conceptual relationship between the two, you can tell they're talking about something similar, but there's a verbal connection. And it's apparent that this is an intentional connection. The author intends for you to recognize that this somehow relates to this. And to give you an example of this, of intertextuality, think, for example, of Deuteronomy 18. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses is about to die. The Israelites are on the cusp of entering into the promised land. And Moses tells them, don't go to the pagans, right? Don't go to people that search out omens and soothsayers and worship idols and that sort of thing. Don't go to people that do the sorts of things that you see Muhammad picking up from the pagans, like crumbs off a table, right? When he circumambulated the Kaaba, threw rocks at the devil, and all that kind of stuff. Moses warns the people of God, don't do that. And then he tells them what they're to do. They're to hold fast to that word which God had delivered through him, and they're to look for a coming prophet. Moses says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brethren. Okay, now the critical term or phrase there is like me, right? Like me. That means that this prophet has to be not merely a prophet. There were many prophets, but in some significant way like Moses. Now, to give you one example of something distinctive of Moses, Numbers 12, remember Miriam and Aaron both challenge Moses and say, you know, we're prophets too. The Lord reveals himself to us. And we're told that the Lord came down and he was wrathful towards Miriam and Aaron, and he rebuked them and struck Miriam with leprosy and, you know, basically says, how dare you speak against my servant Moses? And then God makes this fundamental distinction between Moses and all other prophets, inclusive of Miriam and Aaron. God says, when a prophet appears among you, I reveal myself to him through dreams and visions and so forth. Not so with my servant Moses. With him, I speak face to face or mouth to mouth. So Moses had this unique relationship with God that excelled other prophets. Now, it doesn't mean that other prophets didn't have any kind of direct verbal communication from God or anything like that. But this was the regular means by which God revealed himself to Moses. And it was always, in some sense, superior or greater than what could be said of any other prophet. Now, of course, Moses didn't have an absolute unhindered, if you will, vision of God. No creature could, right? And Moses knew that. Exodus 33, Moses, in verse 10, it's striking. Verse 10 says, Moses spoke with God face to face. And then just 10 or 11 verses later, Moses says, let me see your glory. And God says, nobody can see my face and live. So that shows you that even though Moses excels other prophets in seeing God to a degree that goes beyond them, even that fell short of that absolute face-to-face knowledge of God, which as Christians we recognize only Christ has, right? Which makes him uniquely capable of revealing God to men. And that's the point of John 1 through 18, right? The word was with God, face-to-face with God. And therefore, verse 18 says, he is the one who reveals God, exegetes the Father. So point here is that Moses says there's going to be a prophet like me. And so at least this much must be true of that prophet. He must know God face to face like Moses. Well, some people would argue, Jews have argued, that this prophecy of a prophet like Moses was fulfilled in Joshua or some other figure. Well, what's interesting, and this is part of the significance or usefulness of intertextuality, is that it debunks this sort of thing. So Moses in Deuteronomy 18 says that God will raise up a prophet like me. But in Deuteronomy 34, which was written after the time of Moses, so during or after the time of Joshua, and we know that, nobody disputes this, even though Moses wrote the Torah, the last chapter records Moses's death. And so it was necessarily something that was appended by a subsequent prophet. And Deuteronomy 34, what does it say? It says, now remember, Moses has died. Deuteronomy 34 says, now Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. So it might sound like, okay, Joshua is the fulfillment, the realization of Moses' prediction in Deuteronomy 18. Now, there's already a problem, though, because Joshua was on the scene even when Moses gave that prediction. So, there's already that tension. But listen to verse 10. Immediately after speaking of Joshua succeeding Moses, it says, since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, for all the signs and wonders which the Lord had performed through him in the land of Egypt in the sight of all Israel. So Deuteronomy 34 is an inspired interpretation of Deuteronomy 18 and says, no, it wasn't fulfilled in Joshua. This prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. And that's why the Jews in John 1 come to John the Baptist saying, who do you think you are? And they say, are you the prophet? Among other questions that they asked him. They realized this prediction had not been fulfilled. So that's an example of intertextuality. The same book refers back to something and expands our understanding of it.
So
Now,
if I may say, for the sake of those who are listening to this and maybe join us right now, intertextuality, is it fair to say within the book, intertextuality, multiple books?
yes, exactly.
Okay.
So that's where I was going next. So intratextuality would be when you have something stated in one book, or in this case, if we're looking at Moses, we can consider the whole Torah as, you know, a unit, right? The books of Moses. So something stated, say, in the Torah that's later picked up on by the prophets, and therefore serves as this sort of interpretive key. Now here, just to give an example, I'll use Isaiah and Malachi or Micah. In Isaiah, you have the prediction, Isaiah 7, that the virgin will conceive and bear a child, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Now here again, Jews will pick people out of the hat and say it was fulfilled in this person, can't be Jesus. And you know, we're not going to talk about the prophecy itself and all the ins and outs of it, but if you look at Micah 5, when it's talking about the coming of Messiah, it says in verse 2, as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Now listen to the next line. Therefore he will give them up, meaning Israel, until the time when she who is in labor has borne the child. Right? So there you have a subsequent prophet picking up on language from Isaiah 7, and this is subsequent to the prophecy. And so any person that somebody would propose as a candidate at the time of Isaiah or subsequently, but prior to Micah, couldn't be the fulfillment of that. And so there are a number of examples you can give of this sort of thing. So now bring this over to the discussion that we plan to have here on Isaiah 53 and Genesis 22. Christians recognize that both of these texts are significant with respect to the person and work of Christ, right? We recognize that Isaiah 53 is an express prediction of our Lord's self-humbling and subsequent exaltation, right? The text actually begins on that high note. Before even talking about his suffering, it says, behold, my servant shall act wisely, right? He will prosper. And then it says he'll be high and lifted up and exalted exceedingly. Now, I love that language because the prophet is piling up the terms here to refer to the greatness of this servant. So it's talking about a servant on the one hand, but the terms that are used for him are, number one, significant in themselves, but all the more when put together. Because when you look through Isaiah, and we'll do another show dealing with this in greater depth, but when you look at these terms, they're frequently used for God. When they're used for others, they're often denounced, right? When people consider themselves to be lofty, God says he's going to abase them. But especially in combination, these terms are used exclusively for God, right? So if you look at Isaiah 6, Isaiah, the prophet says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, right? And the train of his robe filled the temple. In Isaiah 2, God says in that day, referring to the future day, he says, the Lord alone will be exalted or high and lifted up. And so here's this servant. It says he's going to be high and lifted up and exalted. And then, as if that's not enough, you know, adding all these phrases together, he adds the word that in Hebrew means exceedingly. So not only do you have these words significant in themselves, but you have them grouped together and then the word exceedingly added to them. So this servant is great, and nevertheless, it goes on to say he's going to suffer incredibly. Now, so Christians recognize this is a prediction about Christ. In fact, not just Christians. Again, we're going to discuss a lot over the course of this series, and I'll show that one Jewish source after another interpreted this messianically. Okay. In fact, Joel Rembaum, who's a Jewish scholar, he's deceased now, but he wrote in, I think it was the Harvard Theological Review, but he said that this passage refers to the Messiah was the dominant view in rabbinic tradition. Okay, this didn't change until the time of Rashi. right? And even then, what's interesting is Rashi didn't start propounding this view until he had this apologetic motive to do so. We have quotes from Rashi interpreting it messianically until it became advantageous in order to argue against Christians and so forth to say it wasn't about the Messiah. But then even after him, there are Jews that would still interpret it along messianic lines. But point here is that Christians recognize this text predicts Jesus. Christians also recognize that Genesis 22 is talking about Jesus, not as what we might call an express prediction, but it's predictive, but in terms of a foreshadowing. That is, God has so orchestrated certain events, and the Spirit has so superintended the writing of what happened so that it becomes a picture of Christ and what he would do. So, that being the case, if you have these two texts that both point to Jesus, it shouldn't be surprising if there are intertextual connections between them. Now, understand, just because two texts point to Christ doesn't mean they have to be intertextually related, right? They can meet in the person of Christ. So, I mean, as an example, like there are passages where it has in view Christ's birth, right? Isaiah 7:14, the virgin will conceive and bear a child. There are other texts that have in view Christ's exaltation. Daniel 7, the Son of Man coming up to the Ancient of Days. These two texts are not intertextually related. They talk about the same person, but they don't have the same thing in view, right? They're two different stages of his career, and the focus of those chapters and passages are different. So it doesn't have to be the case that two things that converge in Jesus are intertextually related. But in this case, we have an intertextual relationship between them. Now, even before getting to something, and I'm only going to deal with one aspect of this today, but even before getting to the verbal connections, it should be evident that conceptually we're dealing with something very similar in both cases, right? In Genesis 22, we have an example of someone giving up another person to death, right? That other is passive in this, in the sense that he's not resistant, but goes willingly. He is, if I could put it this way, going like a lamb to the slaughter, and like a shear before his shearers, right? He remains silent, right? He doesn't raise any protest. And that's, of course, what we see in Isaiah 53. In Isaiah 53, one person is giving up another person unto death. He goes like a lamb to the slaughter. And we also have, just to give one other idea of the conceptual relationship here, you have in both texts the notion of substitutionary atonement, right? Substitutionary atonement is at the heart of the Christian faith. Absolutely. We believe that Jesus substituted himself in our place. We deserved death as a result of violating God's law, but Jesus interposed himself between us and God, represented us, took our place, bore our punishment, and therefore we reap the benefit of that. We go free, right? We are absolved of guilt and so forth. Well, you also have that in Genesis 22. Isaac is not ultimately sacrificed. Rather, it's a lamb. In fact, Abraham is asked by Isaac as they're going up the mountain. Isaac says, where's the lamb, Father? Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham says prophetically, don't worry, my son, the Lord will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So you see Abraham's confidence here. He knows that this can't end in Isaac's death. I mean,
absolutely. By faith, he believed in God's promises. And it's interesting you mentioned this, because the Quran, as you know, mentioned that وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذَبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ, and we substituted for him with a greater sacrifice, which is amazing, if you think about it.
Yeah. As an aside, by the way, I was listening to Nouman Ali Khan, a Muslim speaker, not known as an apologist, but he's well regarded by a lot of Muslims. He's had some sordid matters that have cropped up here and there that have checkered his little popularity. But he's well spoken, and I've listened to him kind of try and compare certain Quranic accounts of things found in the Bible. And he often pretends that, oh, the Quranic account is so much better and so forth. But what often is happening in his case is he's not reading the biblical text very carefully, and he's quite ignorant of Jewish exposition on these things, and doesn't realize that some of the things that he's claiming the Quran is somehow so insightful on and so much better, that they're actually already there in the Jewish sources. And the reason they're there in these Jewish sources is because what the Jews were doing was engaging in intertextual exegesis. They see so much more significance in the offering up of Isaac than a lot of Christians even do, because they're able to see that other texts in the Bible shed light on texts like this. And so they bring out something of the richness. So there's nothing there in the Quran. Whenever the Quran says anything that's insightful or something, you can be sure Muhammad didn't get it, right?
No. What I'm saying is, it's an example of how Muhammad or whomever put it together, copied and pasted without thinking about the significance of something like that.
Yeah. Oh, I knew what you meant, but it made me think of this whole thing, because I thought of doing something on Numan Ali Khan. He's done stuff on Joseph and compared it to the Quranic account, and I keep listening to it thinking, man, this guy, they always want to pretend that the Quran somehow improves upon the biblical story, and there's never a case where the Quran says something that we can say is genuinely true that can't already be found through a close reading of the Bible and Jewish sources. Muhammad had no genuine insights. When Muhammad does say something that you can't find in the Bible or in Jewish sources, it's wrong, right? I mean, almost 90% of the time. And even sometimes the stuff he picks up from Jewish sources is just wrong, right? The Jews don't always make the right turns. Sometimes they get things wrong. But anyway, so there's clearly this conceptual relationship between these two texts. But there's more than that. I've talked before with you, we've talked about this, where Isaac, throughout this text, is referred to as Abraham's son. Right. And
his only son.
Right. And so it uses the term ben, which is the basic, term for son. So, for example, in verse 2, it says, lakach, take now your son, bincha. So it's ben, and then the ending is the second person singular possessive, your, right? Take your son, bencha. So it's the word ben there. But then in the same verse, it says your only son. And here, the word is, or the form there is yachidka, and the word it comes from is yachid, right? So that's the word translated your only son. Now, what's interesting is that word is used, I think it's 12 times in the Old Testament. And in every case, it always refers, people normally say it means only or unique, but it's only ever used of an only son, right? So it's more than just unique or something like that. It's unique with respect to your progeny or heir. And the significance is that in almost every case, when that term is used, it always has reference to a child who's the only child in some significant sense of his parents. And I say in some significant sense because we know there's a sense in which Ishmael was Abraham's son, right? He was a natural son of Abraham through Hagar, right? He wasn't the child of promise. He wasn't born by the power of the Spirit, revivifying Abraham and Sarah and so forth. He wasn't the heir of the covenant, so he's not Abraham's Yachid, right? His only son in that sense. Well, almost every time that term is used, it's used of a child who has either died or is on the verge of dying, and therefore is going to be the subject of intense mourning. Okay? Now, further, many of the occasions when the term is used, it's a prediction of the coming Messiah, right? So I'll give you two examples real quick. In Amos 8, the prophet says, the Lord says through the prophet, I will cause the sun to go dark at midday, right? And it's talking about your festivals, your new moons, and so forth. And then it says, and I will make it a time of mourning as for an only son. Okay, Yachid. Now, what happened at the time of Christ's crucifixion? Right? The sun went dark at midday, right? And what was happening? The sun was dying. And that, I argue, is why the centurion, the lights go on for the centurion. Because in ancient Israel, when the only son of a parent died, a father would respond by tearing his clothing and putting on sackcloth and putting the lights out in the house. Now, sometimes when the heavens go dark, God speaks of it as clothing the heavens with sackcloth, right? And so when the centurion is there at the foot of the cross, the lights go out and the veil of God's temple is torn, then the natural response to this is, whose son must this one be? Right? If a father in Israel would tear his garments and clothe himself in sackcloth and put out the lights, well, then what must be the case with respect to this one? If the temple veil is torn, the lights of the heaven go out, and they're clothed with sackcloth. Whose son must this be? It must be God's son. Well, so we've talked about this, and I've also pointed out that the word, when this is translated into Greek, there's actually two Greek words that are used to translate this, depending on what passage you're looking at. So I said there's like 12 places where the term is used, Yachid. One of the terms that would be used by Jewish translators, and when I say Jewish translators, understand the Septuagint is not the only Greek translation that we have of the Old Testament from Jews. And we don't have full translations from others, but we have partial translations. So we have things from Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, and then we get quotations from people like Josephus. What's interesting is, if you look at the Septuagint, some passages will be translated with the Greek word monogenes, which means only begotten. Other translations will use the word agapetos, which means beloved, right? Beloved son. And so, interestingly, like, these are interchangeable terms, because you'll find, for example, the Septuagint might use monogenes in a verse, but then Josephus will use agapetos, right? So it's, they're using two different words to translate this. And both of these terms are used by the gospel writers. John prefers the term monogenes, right? When he says, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, right? And the synoptic authors prefer the term agapetos. So at the baptism of Jesus, the Father says, "This is my beloved Son." Okay, so there's an example, by the way, of intertextuality. When the Father declares from heaven, "This is my beloved Son," he's saying all sorts of things. I mean, the Jewish ear should have perked up at that point. And let me just make this observation, since I've already gone down this road a bit. But when the Father says at the baptism of Jesus, "This is my beloved Son," he's already telling people not only who this one is in terms of his identity, right? He's no creature. He is my son, right? And the term son is being used in the Gospels in the transcendent sense. We don't have time to discuss that, but that's how it's being used. And in fact, it says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The language, the grammar there indicates that God's favor reposes in this one. He is the object of all his delight, right? So this one, above all others, is his Son. But when he's saying this, he's also announcing this is the one who's come to die for sinners. Why? Because that's how the term is used. It's not just used for an only son, but for an only son who's come and going to be a substitute for sinners, who's going to be the object of mourning and so forth. By the way, another example is Zechariah 12:10, where God says, "They'll look upon me whom they have pierced, and they'll mourn for him as for an only son," right? So clearly prophetic. And the New Testament picks up on this and tips people off to who Jesus is. That's why when Peter confesses Christ's sonship, Remember, in the Gospels, Jesus has done all sorts of things. He's led the disciples to see who he is. And it's at that point that Jesus begins to be more clear about what he's come to do. Why? Because the identity of him as the Son identifies him as the one whom God has sent into the world to die for sinners. And so when Peter confessed Christ's sonship, this should have been part of the understanding. He should have understood, okay, Jesus has to die. But what does Peter do immediately after Jesus praises Peter for his genuine insight into Christ's identity? He says, oh, no, Lord, you're not going to the cross, right? And Jesus rebuked him. Get behind me, Satan. Why should Peter have not, floundered so much there? Why should he have understood what Jesus was saying and not have gotten such a stiff rebuke? Well, precisely because by identifying him as the Son, he should have understood this means not that he can't go to the cross, but that he's the very one that would and must go to the cross, right? Okay, so that's all the setup. Isaac is referred to as God's son throughout the text. I just looked at verse 2, but it occurs over and over again. It's clearly a prominent issue. He's called his son in relation to Abraham in verse 6. Abraham is called his father in relation to Isaac. Isaac calls him my father in verse 7. Abraham says to Isaac, my son in verse 7. Again and again, it says his son, my son, this son, his only son. So you're intended to see this is a son. Now, when you go to Isaiah 53, it might seem, okay, well, you go to Isaiah 53, and even though there's this similarity of one person offering up another being a willing victim, and so forth, but the relationship between the two seems to be quite different, right? In Isaiah 53, you have the Lord giving over his servant to death, right? The first verse of the prophecy says, behold, my servant, right? Then towards the end of the prophecy, he says, my righteous servant. So it begins and ends by identifying him as the Lord's servant. And in identifying him as his servant, that means that the Lord is his master, right? That's entailed by the word Lord, but you have a master-servant relationship here in this text. So on this level, it seems like these two texts there's a difference here. But here's what's interesting. Isaac is not only referred to as God's son, or before getting to that, let me say this. There are others who are there along with Abraham and Isaac, at least traveling to the mountain, right? They remain at the foot of the mountain when Isaac and Abraham go up or ascend the mountain.
That's right.
And they're there when Abraham comes back. And by the way, Jews found it significant when you read the text, even though Isaac isn't actually killed, the text doesn't mention Isaac coming back down with him, right? Abraham says Isaac's going to come back down with him. He says earlier to the servants, you stay here, we're going to go and worship, and then we will return to you. So Abraham knows Isaac's coming back, right? God's going to have to raise him from the dead if I kill him, because God has promised to raise up a multitude of descendants through him and bring forth the Messiah from him. So this can't end in Isaac's death. So Abraham knows Isaac's coming back, but at the end of the text, it doesn't mention Isaac coming back. It just mentions Abraham returning to his men. And so here's what's interesting. Some Jewish texts mention, and they say that because they're picking up on the silence, and they say that Isaac was caught up to heaven and was there with the angels for several years, right? Wow. And then there are other texts who say he went to the school of Shem the Great, which is they believe that Shem was still alive. If you look at the chronology, Shem, is still around in Jewish thinking. So there's all this speculation. Why doesn't it mention Isaac coming back down the mountain? Rather, he after this offering up, he disappears from their sight, if you will.
Yeah, I want to just add one more thing. I mean, there's another significant about that. Just the mere fact that he's at the top of the mountain, biblically speaking, he's exalted. I mean, that's the exaltation right there.
Yeah. Mountain. That's why a lot of the encounters with God take place on mountains, right? Over and over again. prophets encounter God on the mountain, Sinai being the most prominent example. Elijah meets God on the mountain over and over again. There are mountaintop encounters with God. So I mentioned there's these other individuals with Abraham. It mentions his 2 young men, for example, in verse 3. Now, that word is often translated as his 2 servants. Okay. The Hebrew word na'ar is a word, if you check the lexicons, it means a servant, a household servant or something like that. These are obviously 2 servants who have special responsibilities to Abraham, attend to him all the time, because it doesn't, the way the English renders it is it says he took 2 of his young men, as if these are just 2 among them. But what it literally says is that he took his 2 young men. And so it's distinguishing these 2 from his other servants. These have special responsibilities with respect to Abraham. So these are, and again, Jewish tradition says that these 2 young men actually were Ishmael and Eliezer. Okay, I'm not going to speculate there. I'm just saying that's how it was understood by Jews, Ishmael and Eliezer. So much for the Muslim idea that Isaac was not the one sacrificed, but Ishmael was. Now, Ishmael, if he was there, according to the Jews, was just there as a servant. Okay, so this is interesting. The servants are there. Okay, servants. Remember, that word means servants. Okay, and so it can be variously translated, young men or servants, but young men in the sense of those who serve as retainers, right? They're responsible for attending to the needs of those to whom they belong. Okay. Well, why is that significant? Well, because the same term is used in this text for Isaac. Okay. It says, for example, in Genesis 22:5, Abraham said to his 2 young men. Now, again, I hate that translations are not consistent. I'm going to read it in English, but then point out what everybody's probably already going to pick up on before I say it. Verse 5 says, Abraham said to his 2 young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship, and we will return to you. Okay, so notice it refers to his 2 young men, and then it refers to the lad, Isaac. The Hebrew term here is the same. Okay, when it refers to the 2 young men, it uses the Hebrew word na'ar, the dual form, referring to 2 young men. And when it refers to Isaac as the lad, it's the same Hebrew term. So you have the term being used for Isaac here that's the same as that used for Abraham's servants. So this one whom Abraham is taking up the mountain is referred to not only as his son, but also as his servant. In fact, the same thing is pointed up again in verse 12 when the angel of the Lord speaks from heaven and says, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, ha na'ar, right? Na'ar, again, it's the term, right? The term for servant. So Isaac is not only identified as Abraham's son, but as Abraham's servant. Now, if Isaac is identified as Abraham's servant, in some sense, that means that Abraham is Isaac's Lord, right? He is his master, right? Now, by the way, just to point out, this isn't just, I'm establishing it on the basis of the text, but there are Jewish sources that recognize this. I have here, for example, I'll read it to you. This is the Isaiah Targum on Job. Okay, actually, it's Job, Proverbs, and Kohelet. So that would be Ecclesiastes. But listen to what it says in Job 3. And I'm not going to explain how they get this, why they do this, but the Targums are interpretive paraphrases of the Old Testament in Aramaic.
It means translation, basically. That's what it means.
Yeah. So, but what they do often is they expand on the Hebrew text, and the expansions are an example of intertextual exegesis. Right. I'm not saying that it's always accurate. I'm just saying that's the fact. That's what they were doing. They're looking at certain texts. They're picking up on terms. And so they sometimes will introduce an explanation in the course of their translation.
Correct.
And so,
and I want to add one more thing, Anthony, the Targum, the Septuagint or Septuagint, these are important sometimes document to consult with, because that will tell you at least the mindset of at least either the Jews in general or certain Jews, how they interpreted certain things.
Right. Yeah. So here's the Targum. And I said I wasn't going to explain how they get this or anything else. I'm going to quote it for the sake of showing this is something that Jews understood. And it'll bring out a further facet of this. It says in Job 3:19 in the Targum, Jacob, who is called young, and Abraham, who is called old, are there, and Isaac, the servant of the Lord, who went forth free from the fetters of his master, from the bonds of his master. Okay. Now, notice it calls him the servant of the Lord, right? That's the term that Isaiah uses repeatedly, which, eventually climaxes in his announcement in chapter 53 about my servant, right? Throughout Isaiah, he's called the servant of the Lord. And then finally in 53, God says, my servant, right? Behold, my servant. Well, here the Targum calls Isaac the servant of the Lord. But notice it also says that he went forth free from the fetters or bonds of his master. The word Akedah, which you explained at the beginning, or chayed in Hebrew, means to bind, right? And so that's where you get the word Akedah.
Even in Arabic, by the way, in Arabic, qayyada, meaning to bind.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, and interestingly, I mean, Muslims use Akedah to refer to like doctrine, right?
Yeah,
Theology.
exactly. You're bound by it.
Binding teaching, right?
Yeah.
So the word is used in Genesis. In fact, it's only used there. And what's happening, of course, is Abraham takes Isaac up, and before sacrificing him, he binds him to the altar, right? And that's where the Targum says there. It says, Isaac says, "Tie me well so I don't move." Right, when you go to slay me. So that's where you get the word binding. Now, what do you call a person who is bound, right, by another or to another or what have you? Oh, you muted yourself.
You mean, what do you call the person when he's bound?
If a person is bound or in bonds, what is he in relation to the person that he's bound to or bound by or what have you?
I mean, I would say, it could be that's what we're looking at. I mean, under his authority, under his mercy now.
Or a slave,
really,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Or a slave, exactly.
Servant, somebody who's in bonds, somebody who's, who's in fetters, in a sense. And by the way, understand the word na'ar, the word for youth or young men, in Hebrew culture, a child who had not yet attained to maturity and entered into the full enjoyment of his privileges, the full rights of his sonship, is equivalent to a slave or a servant. Remember what Paul says. Equivalent, not in the sense that he is no better off. I mean, but he doesn't have the full benefits of his what he's going to inherit. Remember, Paul in Galatians 4 says that when he's talking about the Jews under the old covenant in comparison to Christians under the new, and he's saying they were in a position of servanthood, we are in a position of maturity, and we enjoy the full privileges of sonship. But he says that a servant differs a son differs no matter from a slave when he's underage, right? He's under tutors and he has schoolmasters. He doesn't have full use of his privileges or authority. And so that would be the case with Isaac, right? He's under Abraham's authority. He hasn't attained to maturity in the sense that he has now taken over all the rights and responsibilities that are his as Abraham's heir. Not getting into how old he actually was. I'm just saying Abraham had not died yet. So Isaac still is in some sense in relation to Abraham in that condition. So Isaac is portrayed as being bound by Abraham, but then, of course, Abraham unbinds him when the angel says, "Don't strike the lad," and so forth. So Abraham is portrayed as his master in Jewish sources, and it follows from the text. He's called Na'ar, and he's bound, right? Well, now here's what's interesting. Let's go back now through the text, because I want to look at what happens in the Greek. When this is translated into Greek, it uses a number of terms. So, for example, let's pull this up here. In Genesis 22. Oh, by the way, I wanted to read real quick a couple of sources here real quick. This is from Giza Vermes. He's commenting on the Targum of Job. He says, "It is precisely on account of his having been bound, that is, because of his self-sacrifice, that Isaac appears to have been given the title servant of the Lord. It would seem, therefore, safe to assume that the Targumic Haggadah on the Akedah resulted from the association of Genesis 22 and Isaiah 53. See, so Giza Vermes, no friend of Christianity, by the way, is saying they saw a connection between these two texts. And that's why they call Isaac the servant of the Lord.
And also, it's kind of interesting, by the way, because if you look at, for instance, Philippians 2, starting from verse 5 all the way down, I mean, it says that Jesus took on the form of a servant in the likeness of man. So it started with the servant, basically, and he humbled himself all the way to the cross. So Isaac, by the way, was silent in that. I mean, you don't hear him talk about complaining or why are you tying me or anything like that. So
right. So that was Giza Vermes. Now, here's another scholar. This is from the Journal of Biblical Literature in an article called Jesus, Isaac, and the Suffering Servant. He says, in Jewish tradition, Isaac is the prototype of the suffering servant, bound upon the altar as a sacrifice. Isaac is described in the Midrash as the first to experience chastisements from God. Remember, the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 is chastised for our sins. He says in the Midrash, Isaac is the first to be described as suffering chastisement from God. And in the Targum to Job 3, he is expressly styled the servant of Yahweh. The servant of Isaiah 53 is thus a new Isaac who dies so that the people might live. Okay, so number one, I just want to reiterate this. I've established this from the text. Okay, that's what's ultimately decisive. Okay, I'm citing scholars not because these are needed to make the point, and I always want to stress this because, the foundation of our faith is the text of the Bible, not these other things. We don't need somebody else to stamp God's papers. Remember when it says that certain people believed in Jesus in the Gospel of John, but it says Jesus wasn't entrusting himself to any man because he knew what was in man. Remember, the belief in John's Gospel is not always used in the sense of saving faith. Often, the people that it says believe are upbraided as not having genuine faith. But it says Jesus didn't entrust himself to them because he knew what was in man. God doesn't need the testimony of any man, right? That's why Jesus, some people will say, why does he silence the demons, when they cry out, he's the Son of God? Wouldn't you think he'd want that? He doesn't need their testimony. He doesn't desire their testimony. Although they end up giving testimony anyways, don't they? Because they're recorded in the scriptures.
Yep.
But, so I am quoting these scholars, though, just to say unbelievers who want to balk at this don't even have that in their favor, right? This is recognized. And moreover, notice these scholars are referring to earlier Jewish interpretations, like what I'm talking about here from the Targum on Job. So Jews are interpreting things this way independently of Christians, just on an analysis of the text. And scholars are recognizing this. So pretty solid. But now, here's what's interesting. When this is translated into Greek, just want to pull up the Greek here real quick. When it refers to the young men in verse 3, it says, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men. Okay. The Greek word is paidos. Okay. I don't pretend to have perfect Greek pronunciation. In seminary, we focused on meaning and grammar and syntax and all of that, and not so much on pronunciation. But they're called paidos. Okay. In verse 5, it says, Abraham said to his young men, there it's paisin, okay? So paidos, paisin. And then in the same verse, after saying Abraham said to his young men, paisin, it goes on to say, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad, ta padarion. Okay, now all these terms are related in Greek. Okay, they're all related to the Greek word pais. Okay, now here's why this is interesting. So first, I'll just read you a source on, and by the way, the terms are used more than the times I just mentioned in Genesis 22. Right? Those are just a handful of examples. If you go through the Greek text, you'll see the terms occurring more than that. So Pais, this comes from BDAG, Standard Lexicon, that refers to Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich on Greek. It says Pais, paidos, means child, and then it has various usages. It can refer to a young person, normally below the age of puberty. It can refer to one's own immediate offspring, such as a child, a son or daughter. And it can refer to one who is committed in total obedience to another, a slave, a servant. Okay, so notice how interesting this becomes. Now you have this term that's used that is ambiguous in itself, right? It's ambiguous and can have more than one meaning, and the meaning then becomes something that's determined by the context, right? So if a Greek person heard this, he'd know that word has both of these ideas. And so both ideas would kind of be there in a sense, even if contextually he knows, well, it favors one or another meaning, but those ideas would be there, right? Well, so that means that Isaac and these servants are both being used or referred to as servants with a word or forms of the word or derivations of the word that can alternately mean son or servant. By the way, I said paidarion is used for Isaac. That's a diminutive form of pais. And so if you look up paidarion, just like pais, it'll say that it means, in BDAG, it says it means a child or a young slave. Okay. Now, why is that interesting? Well, if you go to Isaiah 53, verse 1, where it says, behold my servant, would you be surprised if it uses the Greek word pais?
No, I won't be.
No, you won't be, right? Even if you didn't know, it uses the Greek word pais. It says, behold my servant, ha pais mu, behold, or the servant of me, right? So again, I mean, you have these clear intertextual ties. Now, what then are the implications of this? Remember what I said about intertextuality. Intertextuality establishes connections between texts. And that doesn't just mean you say, okay, this text says this text says this. It means that these two texts now shed light on each other. What this ends up doing for us is showing us that the servant and master of Isaiah 53 are the father and the son, right? It's the father, Abraham, offering up his son, Isaac, the only begotten in Genesis 22. And Isaiah 53, tying in with it, is telling us that these are the individuals who are in view here. The Lord, the Father, is offering up his son who has become a servant. And we know he's become a servant, by the way, from the text itself. Why? Because, as I said, the terms that are used for him are the terms that are used for God. I was reading, by the way, I didn't mention this, but I've read a lot of Jewish works trying to debunk Isaiah 53 as a prophecy of Jesus. One that I read recently is by Gerald Segal, not to be confused with Alan Segal, who's another Jewish guy. He writes all kinds of anti-missionary stuff, and this one's called The Jew and the Christian Missionary, a Jewish Response to Missionary Christianity.
Is Alan Segal who wrote about the two powers in heaven?
Yeah. So that's the other one.
Right.
And then this one likes to write stuff against Christianity. And so here's what's fascinating. in this book, so he has two sections. One section is trying to deal with Old Testament prophecies that Christians use for Jesus. And then the second part of the book is about New Testament stuff that he's criticizing. Well, when you look at the first section of the book, he'll go through these prophecies and he'll give like 1 or 2 page responses to them. Genesis 3:15, 1 or 2 pages, right? Genesis 49:10, 1 or 2 pages. On and on for like, I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, but like, let's just say 15 Old Testament prophecies, right? 1 or 2 pages. When it comes to Isaiah 53, he has 30 pages. and I find this significant, not because the other passages aren't significant and not because he can make easy and short. It's just that you can tell Isaiah 53 really vexes Jews. They really loathe Isaiah 53 and feel the need to respond to it. And so they end up, you know, their slip is showing, right? They end up tipping their hand, revealing their cards, and showing us how much this passage gets under their skin. And I'm trying to remember the reason I brought it up, but Alan Segal had said something that maybe I'll remember it in a second. But the one of the things that he mentions is, and not just him, there are other Jewish scholars that will try and do this. They'll say things like, how could this be Jesus, whom Christians believe to be God, if this servant is going to be exalted? Okay. Because it says he'll be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Okay. For the life of me, I don't know why these guys will say things that they either have to know is false or that just betrays a gross ignorance of the Old Testament, because the terms, remember I said they're used for God, right? They're used for God in the Old Testament. God himself says, I'm going to be exalted in that day. How can God be exalted? All right. I mean, that's the question they should be asking, right? Set aside the servant for a moment. Ask yourself the question, how can God say over and over again, he's going to be exalted? Okay. Now, another example, Psalm 68. Psalm 68 says, he ascended on high, he led captivity captive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Paul picks up on this in the New Testament. And by the way, it's not talking about Sinai, because it says he's among them as at Sinai. So just like the Lord was with them at Sinai, it's talking about some other occasion when the Lord would be among his people and then ascend on high. Okay. How does the Lord ascend on high unless he has first descended? Isn't that Paul's argument in Ephesians 4? A lot of people read Ephesians 4 as though it's talking about Jesus going into Sheol, right? Whether or not scripture elsewhere talks about that, that's not what's going on in Ephesians 4. What Paul says is, when Psalm 68 says he ascended on high, his point is, how can he ascend unless he has first descended, right, to the lower parts of the earth? Lower parts of the earth is an idiom in Hebrew. Look at Psalm 139, referring to a mother's womb. Okay, when Jesus came into the world and entered into his mother's womb, that's described by David as entering into the lower parts of the earth. This world, right? Beneath the tops of the mountains, if you will, where God meets with people. So Ephesians 4 talks about God ascending on high. How can he ascend unless he first descended? Well, by the same token, how can God be exalted unless he was first humbled, unless he first condescended? What is Isaiah 53 talking about? It's talking about the exaltation of a servant who humbled himself to death, the point of death, even death on a cross.
Right.
In order that he might be, as Paul says, highly exalted.
Right. Because the Lord is, high and lifted up. Isaiah himself said that the Lord is exalted above the heavens. So definitely this is exactly an excellent point of how we overlook certain phrases sometimes, or words or terms, not realizing that it has a lot deeper significance than just reading it. Yeah. Well, brother, we want to give a teaser now, because you did mention this is going to be a series. In fact, I want to call it, hopefully Jesus in the Old Testament, but that will be a lot more than just this. So you may want to start thinking about wrapping this one up and excite people about the next one.
Yeah, so that really is the wrap up. That's what I intended to say today. So I haven't really thought through exactly where I want to go next time, although possibly, because there's more concerning the intertextual relationship here that can be brought out, such as the substitutionary nature of these things, the terms that are used, and so forth. But there's really just a whole field of things that are worth discussing, including the connection between the prophecy of the prophet like Moses and Isaiah 53. There's intertextual connections there. There's all these intertextual connections before we even look at the prophecy itself and exposit it. So I'll think through that, but that gives people some idea. We may look at Genesis 22 again, bring out the substitutionary atonement motif, or we may move on to Moses and talk about the connection there, and the whole new Exodus theme, which is connected to the Moses typology and Isaiah 53. Just a lot of incredible stuff. And of course, Isaiah 53 ties in with the whole ceremonial system. I mean, it's amazing the number of words that pick up from what's called the temple cult, right? I use the word cult, and most people are used to hearing that used in a negative sense to refer to spurious Christian groups that pretend Christian groups that pretend to be Christian but aren't. But cult, in the strict sense, just refers to the ritual aspect of religion, that sort of thing. And so the cult of Israel refers to those things pertaining to this temple, priesthood, sacrifice, and that sort of thing. The passage in Isaiah 53 picks up on this language and is rich. I mean, it's just one thing after another. And so there's a lot of stuff. And then there's also stuff that we could talk about in Jewish tradition, how Jews understood the Akedah. There's stuff on how Jews interpreted Isaiah 53. Then, of course, there's how the New Testament picks up and uses these passages. So there's really a lot here. So I hope people will have an interest in this, and hopefully this first episode sparked an interest, and that interest will grow over the course of this.
Absolutely. Thank you again, brother, as always. And just remind people again, you're doing 2 debates. Can you please share more info about that?
Yeah, so I'm going to be appearing at the Our Strong Tower Conference in California, Southern California, with Ministry to Muslims run by George Saig. And there will be several other speakers. I'm the least among them, but Hatun Tash, our sister Hatun, will be there all the way from the UK. Samuel Green will be there. Tony Costa will be involved. Jay Smith will be involved. Dr. Edward Dalcor will be there involved, and so forth. And of course, with several of us converging, there will be others that will show up as well. So, for example, I was talking to Vocab Malone the other day. So if anybody knows Vocab and they want to meet him, he'll be there. Or they know him and want to see him, he'll be there. There are going to be a lot of people there. So you'll get to meet a lot of people. There'll be a lot of interaction. And that means all these people will be giving lectures, testimonies. I'll be doing 2 debates. The 2 debates are with Shadid Lewis. For those that don't know, Shadid has been around a while, but has not been active on the debate front for several years, I would guess. So he's coming back into things. And we'll be debating Isaiah 53. Is it about Jesus? And then secondly, we'll be debating John 1, when the Jewish leaders go to John the Baptist and say, "Are you Elijah?" He said, "No." "Are you the prophet?" He said, "No." "Are you the Christ?" He said, "No." So according to Shadid and other Muslims, the prophet refers to Muhammad, right? Because the leaders distinguish between the prophet and the Christ in their ignorance. Following their ignorance, Shadid and other Muslims think the prophet has to be someone other than Jesus. And since it isn't John either, must be somebody else. Who else but Muhammad, right? Terrible argument, but that's what we're going to do.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And of course, I want everybody to know that after that conference in September, I'll be doing my own online conference, and Anthony will be involved as well. He and I will be finalizing his role. And I'm going to have some of the same speakers. I'll have Dr. Jay Smith. I'll have Dr. Edward Delcor. I'll have Dr. Tony Costa. I'll have Anthony, among just few. And we'll have different tracks as well. Mine is online intentionally. That's the way we want to do it. So again, I hope everyone is already basically capturing the essence and the theme of this particular video series I'll be doing with Anthony about Isaiah 53, just as an example. And after that, we'll look into other areas in the Old Testament and how that can ties into Jesus himself. Hopefully everyone is enjoying it. Do the studies, learn from it, share it with others, and hopefully it will empower you also to try to reason with some of our Muslim friends at the end of the day who are fixated on certain ideas, like, for instance, Deuteronomy 18 applying to Muhammad, and you heard about John 1:19 applying to Muhammad, and the rest can go on and on. And after the debate, I will ask Anthony to come in and kind of like do a assessment of the debate. It's our policy to make sure that I do not ask Anthony to do things like this before the debate. Again, I mean, we want to be respectful to the preparation, and we also don't want to take the element of surprise out as well. I mean, let's just face it.
Well, I realized, and hopefully just when I kind of anticipated for people what we're going to talk about, I realized that there's a lot involved in Isaiah 53. So I don't plan to say necessarily anything that I've already said, right? How am I, we took, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours. I didn't pay attention to the clock. I don't have an hour in an opening statement, right? So I've got to pick all, sorts of things, which means leaving some things out, incorporating other things. So we started off on a aspect of this that I didn't intend to bring up in our debate. So no problem there. I didn't let anything out of the bag. And that's kind of how I do things. I mean, really strategically, if anything, this puts somebody like Shadid in a bad position if he's going off of this to say, hey, this is what Anthony's going to talk about. I'm going to prepare for that. So Shadid, if you're listening, this isn't something you need to focus on because if you do, I'm going to blindside you because this isn't what I'm going to bring up.
Hey, you've heard it from Anthony. All right. We're not trying to pull a fast one on you here. Well, brother, thank you so much as always. We appreciate you. And you and I, of course, will continue our dialogue about part 2 whenever you feel like you're ready for it, whether immediately, like within the next 2 weeks, or if you want to wait until after the debate. I get it. I understand. So either way, I want this to continue.
By the way, I have to say, because Carm will be there too. She wanted me to make sure I mentioned her.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to bring her on the show, bro. So
I'm sure she'd be happy to.
Yeah. So we're working through that.
She's over here heckling me.
Yeah. Yeah, I did notice she left a message about someone also. So I'll go and check that particular person and see what's going on. But all that to say is thank you so much, brother. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you, Sister Mariana. I know it's real early where you're at right now, but I appreciate you taking the time to list also the links for the basically our Strong Tower conference for people. And thank you to the other moderators as well who've been sharing a lot of this information. Again, we'll make a point, like if Anthony comes back again before the conference, we'll mention the conference one more time so that people are encouraged to go and register for it. Again, thank you, brother. Thank you, everyone. This is Al Fadi over and out. God bless. Take care.